We throw away technology all the time. Every 1 or 2 years, we'll dispose of our smartphone and get a newer model. Perhaps every 4 or 5 years, we'll get ourselves a new laptop or a new television, because technology has moved on and we want the latest thing. The same happens to much larger types of technology, including planes, trains, and automobiles. Here are some examples of brilliant technological ideas which have found themselves condemned to the waste bins of history. Our story starts in Liege in Belgium, where we find an example not only of abandoned technology, but also an abandoned technological project. During the 1970s, Liege decided it was going to join the big cities of the world by constructing a subway. There was lots of excitement when digging work started between Bat and St. Leonard, but for a variety of reasons, the work was never completed. That left the city with a useless half-built tunnel, and so they decided to stuff it with unwanted buses, trolley carts, and coaches. The more recent coaches are found close to the entrance of the tunnel, but as you walk down it, you're transported back in time. At around the halfway point, you'll find trams and carriages, along with ticket booths and kiosks. It would seem that all the facilities designed to run the subway were completed after all. It's just that the subway never opened. Instead, it serves as an unofficial Belgium transport museum, and it's become a popular site with urban explorers. We wish we could tell you where the abandoned motorcycle museum of Lockport was. Sadly, we can only tell you where it used to be, and show you these pictures of what it once looked like. In a past life, it was Cole's Cycle Sales, and it was run by a man who simply never said no to the idea of buying or trading a motorbike. Bikes were far cheaper in the 1960s and 1970s than they are now, so Cole quickly built up such a large collection that he needed a warehouse to store them in. When Cole retired in the 1990s, he sold it on to someone who failed to take proper care of the warehouse, and it quickly fell into disrepair. By 2010, the roof was collapsing, the walls were bowing in dangerously, and the wood was rotting. But all the old bikes were still inside. Some of them were rare, exclusive models that may have been one of a kind in the USA. They're all now lost forever. An arson attack in 2013 burned the building, and all of the old bikes inside it to the ground. There are many tales of abandoned Soviet military equipment laying around in Russia and other former Soviet states. But you don't expect to hear about relics of the USSR in the middle of the Caribbean. They're there if you know where to look for them, though, and we do. Pearls Airport in Grenada has accidentally turned into something akin to an open-air Cold War museum. It was used extensively by the Soviet side during the Cold War, who used it as a handy alternative to nearby Cuba, but the Americans took a strong dislike to the practice. The US military invaded Grenada in 1983, and the airport was high up on their list of targets. Their attack put the airport beyond use, and so it was abandoned, along with any planes that were damaged during the assault. One of them was this old crop duster, which still just about has CCCP printed along the side of its fuselage. There was also a Cubana Airlines plane caught up in the crossfire, which was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The British weren't directly involved in the Cold War, but they made plenty of military preparations in case they were dragged into it. If they were, they'd likely have made extensive use of the Handley Page Victor, a jet-powered strategic bomber, which served in the nation's military between 1958 and 1993. Envisioned as a defensive plane, aircraft of this class were considered to be part and parcel of the UK's nuclear deterrent, although this aspect of its duties was abandoned after 1968, when the aging planes began displaying fatigue cracks. From that point on, they were repurposed as strategic reconnaissance aircraft, fitted with radar equipment and cameras. V-bombers were becoming unfashionable by the end of the 1960s, and so the planes lived out their days as aerial refueling tankers, excelling in this role during the Falklands War. Of all the V-bombers the British built, the Handley Page Victor was the last to be retired. The final surviving example of the plane was decommissioned on October 15, 1993. The Alpine Mountains are popular with tourists, but they pose a very specific transportation problem, one that required unorthodox solutions for getting people from the bottom to the top with ease. The Alpine Funicular Railway, which is still standing as a shell in the north of Italy, was believed to be the best solution to that particular problem for a long time. It opened just after the start of the 20th century, and it was still ferrying passengers until the very end of the 1970s. Not everybody is a mountain climber, and so the railway would carry people from the side of the lake up to the very top, where they could enjoy the restaurants and hotels. At its peak, it had 30,000 customers every year. It closed down because it was old and in dire need of repair. Since then, someone's been coming back to make sure the facilities and cars get a fresh coat of paint. But nothing here has moved in over 30 years. Perhaps one day, it will be put back to work. If there was ever a piece of mining equipment we wouldn't want to accidentally get in the way of, it's Bagger 258. Created by the heavy machinery company Lauchhammer, Bagger 258 is a bucket wheel excavator of the type used in mining operations by East Germany during the 1960s. This behemoth of a machine featured 10 enormous blades, each of which was capable of cutting almost 50 feet into the surface of the earth. It ripped away the soil from layers of coal and then collected the coal into one of its 5,000 square foot buckets. It was a clever robot. It would then sift the coal and deliver it to its own engines, which were dependent on coal to keep moving. We don't know whether it's more accurate to call the 4,000-ton Bagger 258 a vehicle or a factory on tracks. It stood 160 feet tall and was over 500 feet long. It could still probably rip the ground up now if someone powered it up, but it's been out of use since 2002 because it's basically got nothing left to dig for. Earlier on, we mentioned that there's a lot of old Soviet military equipment laying around in Russia, and this is a great example of what we mean. It's an Il-28U bomber, and it's been minding its own business under a canopy of trees for more than 40 years, presumably waiting for whoever left it here to come back. We may never have found it at all, but it was discovered by chance by a man who'd walked alone into the forest to pick some mushrooms. Unable to believe what he was seeing, he ran home to grab his camera and took some photos of his discovery. When he first saw it, he says all of the equipment was still on board, including the radar identification system and its power supply. Since then, it appears that scrap metal thieves or military enthusiasts may have gotten to it, although it's still unmistakably an Il-28U. Sticking with Russian military equipment for a moment, here's a vehicle which had an even grander purpose than the Il-28U. It's the Bereev VVA-14, and it was built to combat American missile submarines. This is a hybrid vehicle, more accurately described as an amphibious aircraft. The Russians needed a genius to develop it for them, and so turned to famous Italian designer Robert Bartini. The Great Master created a prototype model in 1972, but it didn't quite tick all the boxes the military wanted. It flew in the air without a problem, and it could move over water, but the Russians wanted it to be able to take off from and land at sea. Bartini was still trying to make that a possibility when he passed away in 1974. With nobody capable of replacing him in the role, the prototype was abandoned. Nowadays, it's peeling and rusting at the Soviet Central Air Force Museum, which has been charged with its care since 1987. Is this a car? Is it a tank? Is it a boat? Well, on its best day, it was intended to be all three. This curious, one-of-a-kind vehicle was the brainchild of designer Nikolaevich Melnichenko and went by the name of the Argo. We think he might have watched one too many James Bond movies when he designed it in the 1960s. It's supposed to be an amphibious car that could be driven underwater. Melnichenko worked at the GSKB Chelyabinsk tractor plant and was convinced he could turn his dream into a reality. The Argo wasn't a bad attempt. The 8 wheels generated power, which was conveyed through a special hydraulic system into the engine, which almost made it self-powering. The thick plating on the exterior has a hermetic seal, so it would probably be fine to go underwater. Sadly, he never got around to fitting an engine, so we'll never know if it could really swim. Unless someone wants to buy it now and finish the job for him. When a plane is lost in a frozen lake, it's pretty much a given that it's never going to find its way home again. There's an exception to every rule, though, and in our case, the exception is this P-39 Era Cobra, which was loaned to the Soviet Union under the Allied Lend-Lease program during the Second World War. Nobody knew why it vanished during the war. It simply disappeared from the formation group it was flying in and disappeared. 60 years later, it was discovered by chance in the icy depths of Mart-Yaver Lake, Russia. And considering all the time that's passed, it was in incredible condition. Investigators were even able to pinpoint the cause of the crash. 2 engine rods failed, and oil pressure dropped suddenly. Even the flight logs were legible, and the tins of stew that were still stashed on board looked edible, although we probably wouldn't recommend trying. Once safely extracted from the water, this veteran P-39 was sent on its long voyage home to its original assembly plant. Vladimir Chernikov is a man who likes to investigate rumors thoroughly. For years, he'd heard stories that there was an old train of some kind in the middle of the Siberian wastelands. And so one day he got on his bike and decided to go and check it out for himself. He assumed he'd find pieces of an old Russian train or tank, but what was waiting to greet him was much harder to explain. It was all that remained of an old Victorian British steam engine, right in the middle of the taiga in Krasnoyarsk. He did some digging and found out that the train was sent to help ferry loads during the Yenisei Gold Rush, which occurred during the middle of the 19th century. It was once the property of a company named Richard Garrett & Sons, but they presumably declined on having it back when the gold rush was over. Vladimir believes that 150 years in the wilderness is long enough for what's left of the train, and so he'd like to find a home for it in a museum. Finding an old British steam engine in the middle of the snow is probably quite exciting. Stumbling across 200 T-72 tanks you weren't expecting to see is likely to be downright terrifying. But it's happened to someone in Yekaterinburg Forest in Sverdlovsk. They look like an occupying army, but according to the Russian military, they're just temporarily being stored there until a more permanent placement can be found. Allegedly, they're under constant surveillance, but the number of people who've been able to walk up to them and climb on them to take pictures without being interrupted seems to cast doubt on that suggestion. The tanks come along the train tracks to Elenskaya and are then moved to the forest pending further instructions. It's been happening on and off since late 2010. Occasionally, the tanks are all moved on, but a few months later, they mysteriously reappear again. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.